Hello everyone, Max here with Fiction Rant, bringing you part 8 of my series discussing the Borg vs. Cybermen contest. This part will cover my final conclusions on this matchup. To quickly recap from the intro section, there's multiple scenarios I'll be comparing for this matchup. Those are ship versus ship, fleet versus fleet, soldiers versus soldier, army versus army, and who wins in a galactic domination race. Unfortunately for this particular comparison, I wasn't really able to dig up any useful information on cyber ships. Their numbers, capabilities, nothing. So the first two scenarios I'm going to be calling no contest since, while the Borg are fairly well documented, I really have nothing to compare them to for space combat. Sorry everyone, the space matchup is boring this time. What's much more interesting is the ground matchup, especially because there's real information to be gleaned about both sides. Starting with the 1v1 Borg drone versus Cyberman, I think this is actually a pretty straightforward matchup. I think the Cyberman wins pretty much every time. This is largely because this is a first-time encounter, so neither side is adapted to the other, and neither knows what to expect. So whereas the Borg drone comes with all sorts of downsides, like not typically being equipped with weapons unless the situation specifically requires it, their adaptation not really working at all for the first few drones in a fight, and the fact that their nanites require not only physical contact, but also that the drone overpower their enemy. Meanwhile, the Cybermen are all but indestructible, have the same level or greater physical strength than Borg drones, have integrated weaponry, both a taser kind of weapon and laser guns, and this isn't even including the super Cybermen we see in Nightmare in Silver. This is just your standard run-of-the-mill Cyberman that has all of these things standard. So yeah, 1v1, I'd give this matchup to the Cyberman pretty much every time. Army versus army is where things start to get weird, and I think it all comes down to who can adapt to what. For starters, the Borg can absolutely adapt to cyber guns and tasers very quickly, rendering them immune to those attacks. What they don't seem to be able to adapt to is being physically overpowered, either through the use of bladed weapons or by having people like Data, who are just plain crazy strong, break their necks and tear out cables and such. I think the Cybermen are strong enough to do that. So I see the battle very quickly going from a firefight to a brawling match, at least on the Cybermen side. I'll assume that in the event of an army battle, the Borg would actually bother arming their drones, so whatever the handheld version of a cutting beam is, I don't recall ever seeing them on screen, but that doesn't mean they don't exist. The Borg don't really use phasers or disruptors, so the question becomes, would Borg drone weaponry actually be effective against the Cybermen? I'm actually going to say no, it wouldn't. You have to understand, especially if you're a fan of New Who and haven't watched a lot of the older stuff, the Cybermen that you see in New Who are typically really primitive. The super Cyberman from Nightmare in Silver is the major exception to that. The more primitive Cybermen could be taken down by just concentrated fire or overwhelming force. They were pretty bullet resistant, but beyond that, they weren't indestructible by any means. Typically, though, one of the defining characteristics of Cybermen is that they are basically impervious to damage with the exception of gold, which basically just fries their systems. Keep in mind, this is against really advanced factions that show up throughout the Doctor Who universe. They're all spacefaring, they all have sophisticated weaponry, and yet the Cybermen are immune to all of their weapons except for gold. And this is a problem in this particular kind of matchup because the Borg don't really just carry around gold. So the Borg wouldn't win a fistfight against the Cybermen, and their weapons wouldn't be terribly effective either. So what about nanites? What about assimilation? Here's where I think the Borg may be able to level the playing field or even take the fight entirely. The nanotubes that Borg use to inject their nanites are supposed to be able to pierce basically anything, so I have no problem assuming that they could inject nanites into Cybermen. Once injected into your typical Cyberman, I think the nanites would have a field day changing the largely robot body into a friendly. I don't think that much of the regular assimilation process would even be necessary when capturing Cybermen, since most of that process involves replacing body parts with cybernetics. The Cybermen are basically all robot except for their brains, so the nanites would be more than enough to convert them over to being new drones. One exception, though. The super Cybermen that I keep referencing, they have the ability to adapt and become immune to any attack within seconds, and I'm going to assume that that includes an attack from an infestation of microscopic machines. I think that the Super Cyberman would basically be the ultimate anti-Borg weapon because I don't think they can be assimilated. The Borg simply can't beat them. You get to see this really clearly during the conflict with Species 8472, where the Borg were getting wrecked because they simply couldn't assimilate any of the aliens with their hyper-aggressive immune systems. So what does this mean for the Army versus Army matchup? I think that depends. In a standard matchup of standard drones versus standard Cybermen, I think all the drones will be wiped out, but they'll be able to assimilate enough of the Cybermen that even if the Cybermen managed to destroy all the infected, there just wouldn't be that many left by the time the fighting was done. So I think that the Borg would win more than they would lose, but it would be a bit of a toss-up, honestly. If, however, there are any number of Super Cybermen involved, the fight becomes really lopsided instantly. They'd be impossible to assimilate, immune to all the damage the Borg could inflict, and would be able to move at blinding speed that the Borg simply couldn't deal with. If supers are involved, the Cybermen win every time. As for galactic conquest, all the same factors persist, but we're stretching the time frame pretty dramatically. Both factions would be able to spread like wildfire through their starting regions, though I think the Borg would spread faster since assimilation can be conducted at a large scale with very little infrastructure requirements, whereas the Cybermen need large facilities and lots of resources to do the same. That said, the Cybermen transmat would allow them to jump from planet to planet in the blink of an eye without the need for ships, so they'd be able to focus their resources on spreading rather than shipbuilding. I still think that the Borg would spread faster, but the transportation advantage for the Cybermen would... it matters. When the two sides encounter each other, I think that the first few encounters would go very badly for the Borg, but they'd gather some very important information about their enemies, mainly the weakness to gold, and that Super Cybermen are not to be messed with. Once they had that information, the fighting would turn against the Cybermen badly. The Borg would be able to get a hold of all the gold they could ever need by just mining asteroids and such, and use it to fight and destroy standard Cybermen with no problem. As for dealing with supers, well, the Empire of Man, or whatever they're called in the Nightmare in Silver episode, already proposed the solution to that problem. Just blow up the planet they're on. Borg would absolutely be capable and willing to take this kind of drastic action against this kind of enemy. In addition, Borg would be absolutely capable of capturing supers using transporters and either keeping one for long-term study and finally being able to learn how to adapt to it, or just transporting them directly into stars or something. They could do that. Regardless of how the conflict was conducted, I think that the Borg would ultimately win, though they'd have a hell of a time actually exterminating all the Cybermen since they're like roaches, and a remnant always seems to survive. If time travel gets involved in any significant way, I think the Borg still wins the galactic conflict because they'll get a hold of the tech sooner or later and just be able to abuse it the same way the Cybermen do. I don't think that that'll stay a unique advantage for very long at all. So there you go. My conclusions on how the matchup between the Borg and the Cybermen would go. Honestly, I'm surprised at my own conclusions, but I'm having a hard time coming up with any other conclusion given the research I've done. If any of you think differently or have some X factor I've ignored, please let me know in the comments, and until next time, live long and prosper, and may the Force be with you.